Tonight, we begin with a development that U.S. officials, regional analysts, and Baghdad's own security apparatus had feared, prepared for, and desperately hoped to prevent. A crisis that unfolded not over weeks of quiet diplomacy, not over months of careful back-channeling, but in hours. Hours that brought Baghdad to its knees. Hours that plunged millions of Iraqi civilians into darkness. Hours that forced Tehran to make a decision the entire Middle East is now watching with held breath. What Kurdish forces did today crossed a line that Iraqi federal authorities had hoped would hold, a fragile, unwritten boundary between regional autonomy and open sabotage of national infrastructure. And when that line broke, Iran did not hesitate. They responded with speed, scale, and the kind of military posturing that turns a regional crisis into an international emergency. For months now, there had been signals, not official communiques, not formal intelligence briefings passed through diplomatic channels, just signals that Kurdish militant factions operating in northern Iraq were preparing something unprecedented in both scope and audacity. Kurdish political movements have been restless, yes, but they have been calculated in their restlessness. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a choreography. Protests here, a border skirmish there, rhetoric escalating at predictable intervals before cooling just enough to prevent a full confrontation. But what set off alarm bells in Baghdad and in Tehran's security councils this past week was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor militant activity in the Kurdish autonomous regions know the indicators. The uptick in encrypted communications between northern commanders, the unusual movement of engineering units near power infrastructure corridors, the quiet withdrawal of civilian Kurdish workers from joint federal facilities, the sudden disappearance of key figures from their known locations, all of that went quiet. And when a disciplined militant network goes quiet, it doesn't mean they've stood down. It means they've already moved into position. Early this morning, Iraqi Federal Intelligence Services detected what they described as coordinated pre-operational movement along 3 separate infrastructure corridors in Kirkuk and Saladin provinces, including the activation of remote detonation networks that had not been observed since the ISIS-era infrastructure campaigns of 2016 and 2017. These are the kinds of tactical signatures that experienced Kurdish militant cells only deploy when they are signaling something very specific, a warning strike, a capability demonstration, or the opening move of a sustained pressure campaign. Iraqi officials didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all 3 at once, but what they did know was that Kurdish militant leadership was changing its strategic posture. And when a non-state armed movement shifts its posture without public announcement, even by a fraction, regional powers pay attention. Iran, which maintains deep and complex ties to both Baghdad's government and to rival Kurdish factions, was watching too. The question was no longer if something would happen. The question was when and how big. They got their answer before noon. The strike on Baghdad's western power grid was not a symbolic act. It was not a warning shot. It was not a miscalculation. It was deliberate, it was surgical, and it was catastrophic in its immediate effect. Intelligence source after intelligence source described the operation as precisely planned, operationally sophisticated, and, perhaps most importantly, designed to be undeniable so that Baghdad could not quietly absorb the blow without a public response, because that is the strategic logic here. Forced escalation only works if the target is pushed into the open. Kurdish factions understood that if Baghdad had to respond publicly, Iran would be pulled in. Baghdad did not hesitate. Within 6 hours of the strike, Iraqi federal forces launched a series of targeted raids against suspected coordination cells in Kirkuk province. These weren't routine law enforcement operations. These were joint operations, command-coordinated military actions, the kind that Iraq only authorizes when they are preparing to hold territory and push a message simultaneously. But that was not the most significant response. The most significant response came not from Baghdad, it came from Tehran. Tonight, regional military monitors confirmed that Iranian armored units, including T-72 tank formations and mechanized infantry brigades, have begun repositioning toward the Iran-Iraq border in what officials are describing as a demonstrative mobilization. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps moved assets from staging areas near Kermanshah and Elam provinces, including armored vehicles that had recently been forward deployed for what analysts believe was a readiness exercise that was, in reality, preparation for rapid border reinforcement. Iran positioned its forces before Kurdish militant networks could consolidate their hold on the surrounding terrain. They moved toward the Penjwin corridor. They moved toward the Qasr-e-Shireen axis. They moved toward mountain passes that were likely being assessed for use as resupply and retreat routes. In other words, Iran targeted the operational depth of any potential Kurdish escalation, the infrastructure that would have made a sustained campaign viable. This is what made international observers' warnings so urgent from the first hour. The Baghdad power grid strike wasn't simply sabotage. It was an invitation to a larger conflict, designed to draw multiple actors into a confrontation that Kurdish leadership believes it can navigate to its advantage. And Iran, understanding that fully, responded not with diplomacy, not with a phone call, not with a statement, but with tanks. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but with the kind of deliberate, visible force that carries a message louder than any press release. They didn't strike first. They didn't cross the border. They positioned on the ridge. They turned on the headlights. And in this region, everyone knows what that means. And here's where the story becomes even more consequential. Senior regional analysts now believe that the Kurdish strike on Baghdad's power infrastructure was specifically designed to test the resolve of the Iraqi federal government at a moment of unusual political vulnerability in Baghdad. Kurdish militant leadership wanted to see whether Prime Minister Mohammed Shia al-Sudani's coalition government would fracture under pressure, whether Shia political blocs would turn on each other rather than unify against a common external threat. But instead, the opposite happened. Baghdad's response was not fragmented. It was unified, rapid, and coordinated in a way that surprised even observers sympathetic to the Kurdish cause. You don't get that kind of unified response from Baghdad easily, not in a political environment as fractured as the current one. But today, the threat of a power crisis affecting millions of civilians did what months of political negotiation couldn't. It unified Baghdad's factions behind a single operational response. Military analysts speaking with regional outlets under condition of anonymity described the Kurdish leadership's gambit as a calculated provocation, a way to expose seams in Iraq's national cohesion and leverage international sympathy in the same stroke. But Baghdad proved today that it retains both the institutional capacity and the political will to respond. Their operations were not only swift, they were precise enough that civilian casualties in the initial federal raids appear to have been minimal, which matters enormously for the narrative battle that will follow. That precision matters because it shows operational discipline. It shows that Baghdad is not reacting in panic. They are responding with intent. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the full scale of what unfolded in these critical hours. Iraqi federal air assets conducted reconnaissance sorties over 3 northern provinces, forcing militant networks to disperse from pre-positioned locations and break the coordinated command structure that made the original strike possible. Iranian IRGC ground forces moved armored columns toward crossing points that had been active in cross-border smuggling and weapons transfer networks in the last 18 months. Tribal militias allied with Baghdad, operating in disputed territories between Kurdish and Arab administrative zones, reportedly seized communications infrastructure used by militant factions to coordinate the morning's operation. This wasn't just a security incident. This wasn't just a military repositioning. This was a regional recalibration. This was a message sent simultaneously by multiple actors to a single audience. And that message is the one thing Kurdish militant leadership has struggled to counter since the collapse of the ISIS territorial project opened up the current power competition in northern Iraq. For every pressure campaign they have mounted, Baghdad and Tehran together have countered with something that raises the cost of escalation faster than the political gains can accumulate. Remember, Kurdish militant strategists thought that Baghdad's political dysfunction would make a coordinated federal response impossible. They thought that Iran's attention was consumed by its nuclear negotiations and its ongoing proxy competition with Israel and the United States. They thought that the international community's general sympathy for Kurdish political aspirations would translate into hesitation or even tacit support when it came to a bold infrastructure strike designed to force a negotiation. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Baghdad is unified in a way it hasn't been in years. Iran is mobilized in a way that demonstrates its commitment to maintaining influence over Iraq's territorial integrity. And the international community, rather than expressing sympathy, is watching with alarm as a regional conflict risks pulling in actors and timelines that no one is ready to manage. The miscalculation at the heart of today's events is a familiar one in this region. The belief that a dramatic provocation will force a favorable negotiation rather than triggering an escalation that erases the political space the provocateur needs to survive. What makes this moment so dangerous and so volatile is that the Kurdish strike happened at a time when Prime Minister al-Sudani is under extraordinary pressure from multiple directions. Shia Islamist hardliners want a maximalist military response that reasserts federal authority over every disputed territory. Moderate Shia and Sunni coalition partners want a diplomatic off-ramp that avoids a war that would devastate northern Iraq's economy and infrastructure. Kurdish political parties with seats in Baghdad's parliament, distinct from the militant factions behind today's strike, want a negotiated solution that doesn't trigger collective punishment of the Kurdish population. And Iran wants strategic clarity about who controls the northern corridors, and they want it now, not in 6 months after another round of failed talks. Al-Sudani is balancing all of these demands while simultaneously managing a national power crisis affecting Baghdad, Basra, and at least 4 other major Iraqi cities. When leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from a position of strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from the awareness that every hour of darkness in Baghdad is another hour in which their political opponents can build a narrative of governmental failure. The statement issued by the Iraqi Joint Operations Command tonight was not routine. It was not bureaucratic. It was not crafted for quiet diplomatic consumption. It was urgent, public, and unambiguous in a way that suggests Baghdad wanted the entire region to hear it clearly. Senior officials said plainly that the attack on national power infrastructure was a direct assault on the sovereignty and civilian welfare of the Iraqi state, and that those responsible would be identified, located, and held accountable through all available legal and security instruments. That is diplomatic language for, we know who did this, we know where they are, and we are coming. You don't typically hear that tone from Baghdad unless there is both the political will and the operational capability to back it up. Tonight, there appears to be both. Meanwhile, Iraq's prime minister addressed a national security emergency session this evening in a composed, direct, and, by his standards, unusually forceful address to the Iraqi people. He said, "The lights will return to Baghdad and accountability will follow." He said, no force, or internal or external, has the right to hold the Iraqi people hostage to political ambitions by destroying what belongs to all Iraqis. And he said, Iraq's response will be proportionate, lawful, and final. These are not rhetorical gestures for a domestic audience. These are statements from a government leader who understands that every word tonight is being read in Erbil, in Tehran, in Washington, and in Ankara, and that the clarity of his message determines the credibility of everything that follows. Here is what makes the situation even more alarming. The power grid strike was not an isolated event. Along with the primary infrastructure attack on Baghdad's western grid, a separate cell detonated an explosive device near a fuel pipeline junction in Saladin province, temporarily disrupting supply to a thermal power plant that feeds northern Baghdad. Coordinated cyber intrusions, still being assessed, targeted the supervisory control systems of at least 2 Iraqi electricity substations, suggesting a hybrid operation with both physical and digital components. Armed groups increased their checkpoint presence on roads connecting Kirkuk to Mosul, restricting federal logistics movement in a corridor that is critical for any military response into the north. All of this happened within the same 6-hour window. When a militant network moves multiple components simultaneously, physical sabotage, cyber interference, and territorial control, it means something larger has been planned, resourced, and rehearsed. This was not improvised. This was a campaign launch. Senior analysts are now working through several distinct scenarios as they try to assess where this goes next. One possibility is that Kurdish militant leadership is preparing a sustained infrastructure pressure campaign, designed not to win militarily, but to make the economic cost of continued federal authority over disputed territories unbearable. Another possibility is that the strike was designed to trigger an overreaction from Baghdad, one that would generate international condemnation and revive Kurdish political claims at the United Nations and in European capitals. A third possibility, and the one that has officials in Baghdad, Tehran, and Washington most alarmed, is that this is the opening phase of a coordinated effort to exploit Iraq's current political fragility to force a renegotiation of the entire constitutional framework governing Kurdish autonomy and resource rights, with violence as the leverage. But today, Iran took one of those scenarios off the table. By repositioning its armor toward the border, Tehran sent a message that it will not allow the destabilization of the Iraqi federal state. Regardless of how the political factions in Baghdad respond, Iran didn't wait for a UN resolution. Iran didn't wait for an Arab League statement. Iran didn't request an emergency session of any diplomatic body. Iran moved tanks. And in the language of this region, that is the clearest message available. What we are watching unfold tonight is a test of strategic patience and strategic nerve. Kurdish militant leadership wants to see whether Iraq's political coalitions will collapse under the combined pressure of a civilian crisis and a military standoff. Baghdad wants to demonstrate that federal authority is both legitimate and enforceable, that a strike on national infrastructure is not a negotiating tactic, but an act of war against the Iraqi people. Iran wants to prevent any outcome that weakens the central government in Baghdad, which remains the primary vehicle through which Tehran exercises political influence in Iraq. And the United States, which has forces stationed in Iraq and has long-standing relationships with both the Kurdish regional government and the Iraqi federal government, wants to prevent a shooting war that would force every actor in the region to pick a side in a conflict that benefits no one except those who profit from permanent instability. All four of these objectives are in tension tonight, and none of them can be fully achieved without some of the others being frustrated. Tonight, we have heard from intelligence monitoring services that are now tracking Iranian armored unit movements in real time along the Kermanshah-Penjwin axis. They say Iranian armor has moved to within 30 kilometers of the Iraqi border, close enough to constitute a clear military signal, but not close enough to constitute a crossing. They say Iraqi federal forces have established a forward command post in Kirkuk to coordinate the northern response, the first time such a post has been activated since the ISIS military campaigns, and they say the Kurdish political leadership's decision to remain publicly silent about today's strike, offering neither a claim of responsibility nor a denial, is likely part of a deliberate ambiguity strategy intended to preserve political options while the military picture develops. But Baghdad is not confused. In fact, Baghdad is more operationally focused than it has been in years. Their response today, coordinated, proportionate, and strategically visible, sent a message to Kurdish militant networks that the era of consequence-free infrastructure attacks is over. And it sent a message to Iran that Iraq's federal government, whatever its internal contradictions, remains a functioning partner in regional security. As the night goes on, we expect more details to emerge about the full scope of the Kurdish operation, how long it was planned, how many personnel were involved, and whether the cyber component reflects a new capability that changes the threat calculus entirely. But what we do know is that Baghdad's response was timely in the most important sense. It prevented the power outage from being framed purely as a government failure by immediately establishing it as an act of deliberate sabotage. It preserved the political unity of al-Sudani's coalition at a moment when fracture would have been catastrophic. And it gave Iran a reason to demonstrate support for Iraqi federal sovereignty in a public, visible way, which actually reduces the risk of miscalculation because all actors now know where Tehran stands. What happens next will depend entirely on what Kurdish militant leadership chooses to do in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they stand down, even quietly, even without admission, this moment may be remembered as a dangerous miscalculation that was nonetheless contained before it metastasized into something regional. If they escalate, Baghdad, Tehran, and potentially Washington have all already shown that they are not willing to absorb another strike without a response that is bigger and more permanent than anything we've seen tonight. They have shown they are ready, and tonight, for the first time in years, Kurdish militant leadership appears to be genuinely uncertain. Northern Iraq is quiet, too quiet, and when a network that just launched a multi-component campaign goes quiet within hours of the response, it means they are recalculating. It means they are looking at the tanks on the Iranian border and the federal forces in Kirkuk and asking whether the plan that looked so clean on paper still makes sense now that the other players have shown their hands. Because tonight, Kurdish militant strategists learned something, perhaps for the first time at this scale, that Baghdad can unify faster than its dysfunction suggests, that Iran will not allow geopolitical ambiguity to be exploited through civilian infrastructure attacks, and that the moment you plunge a capital city into darkness, you do not generate sympathy, you generate resolve. This story is far from over. The power will return to Baghdad's streets, the tanks will remain on the Iranian border, and the political reckoning over Kurdish autonomy, over resource rights, over the constitutional architecture of the Iraqi state will continue. But tonight, one thing is clear. The strike that was meant to expose Iraq's weakness instead revealed its capacity to respond. The provocation that was meant to divide Baghdad instead united it. And the conflict that was meant to force a negotiation has instead forced every actor in this region to reconsider just how far they are willing to go and just how high the cost of miscalculation has become. We will be here watching every development, tracking every armored column, and following every diplomatic signal as the next phase of this crisis unfolds. Stay with us.